Cannabis is among the earliest plants deliberately cultivated by human societies. Archaeological discoveries from the island of Taiwan, dated to more than 10,000 years ago, provide strong evidence of this early relationship. At a Neolithic site, fragments of pottery were found bearing impressions made by hemp cords pressed into the wet clay. Alongside these shards, archaeologists uncovered elongated, rod-like tools used to process hemp fibers, clear indications that cannabis was not only present, but purposefully utilized by these prehistoric communities. This evidence places cannabis squarely within the category of plants that accompanied the shift from nomadic subsistence to settled agricultural life. It was during this pivotal period, known as the Neolithic Revolution, that humans began domesticating plants not merely for food, but for utility in fabric, toolmaking, and housing. Cannabis, with its fast growth cycle, resilient nature, and versatile fibers, would have offered clear advantages to emerging agrarian societies. Unlike more fragile crops, it demanded little irrigation, resisted pests, and could be harvested within a single season. The decision to cultivate cannabis was not incidental. Its fibers could be twisted into rope and spun into fabric, serving as a crucial material for clothing, shelter, and tool construction. Its seeds, rich in oil and nutrients, provided sustenance and possibly lighting oil for early dwellings. The multifunctional nature of the plant would have made it indispensable to communities adapting to life in permanent settlements. This early evidence from Taiwan is corroborated by parallel finds across the Chinese mainland, particularly in the Yellow River Basin, one of the world's cradles of civilization. Abel notes that hemp was almost certainly one of the first crops intentionally grown for fiber in ancient China. Over time, cannabis cultivation spread outward from these centers, carried not only by trade, but by its inherent value as a utilitarian plant. In these earliest phases, cannabis was not consumed for intoxication. Its value lay in its practicality. Its domestication, like that of wheat, barley, and flax, represented a strategic choice in the development of complex societies. It is in this context, as a cultivated species dating back to the dawn of agriculture, that cannabis stands as a historical constant, a plant embedded not in myth, but in the very material foundations of early human survival. In ancient China, cannabis emerged not simply as a cultivated plant, but as a critical element of early material culture. Its presence extended across multiple domains: agriculture, domestic production, medicine, and social custom. Evidence from early Chinese texts and burial sites reveals that cannabis was not only abundant, but deeply embedded in the social and economic structures of early Chinese civilization. The plant was known by the name Ma, a character that graphically represents stalks of hemp drying under a roof, a visual acknowledgement of its routine processing. This linguistic detail is more than symbolic. It reflects the normalization of hemp in everyday life, from textile manufacturing to ceremonial practice. According to Abel, by the 2nd millennium BCE, hemp fiber was already essential in the production of garments, fishing nets, ropes, and other practical items. In rural communities, women spun hemp fibers into thread during the winter months, a seasonal rhythm of labor that suggests its ubiquity across class and gender lines. Its economic significance is further underscored in state records. The Shu King, a classic Chinese text dating back to around 2350 BC, lists hemp among the tribute items demanded from provincial territories, placing it alongside silk, lead, and jade. This inclusion signals its value not just at the household level, but within administrative and political economies. Moreover, the symbolic role of hemp in ritual contexts is preserved in the Book of Rites, which prescribed that mourners wear garments made of hemp as an expression of filial piety and respect for the dead. This regulation extended into imperial codes and persisted for centuries, indicating a stable ritual association between hemp and social order. Cannabis also contributed to military technologies. Abel notes that once the strength of hemp bowstrings was discovered, Chinese armies adopted it over bamboo, giving their archers greater range and precision. In an era where warfare depended heavily on archery, this was a practical innovation with direct consequences for military effectiveness. Importantly, the recognition of cannabis's botanical complexity was also present. The Chinese distinguished between male and female plants, noting that males produced stronger fiber, while females yielded more nutritious seeds. Such observations speak to an early empirical understanding of plant biology, long before the formal development of botanical science. Cannabis, therefore, was not peripheral. It was a resource woven into the infrastructure of Chinese society, agriculturally cultivated, economically valued, ritually prescribed, and militarily exploited. Its status as a multi-purpose plant was not theoretical. It was practiced, encoded, and sustained over centuries of dynastic continuity. Cannabis was not only valued in ancient China for its practical applications, it was also integrated into the earliest systems of medicine. By the time of the legendary Emperor Shén, around 2700 BCE, cannabis had entered the canon of traditional Chinese pharmacology. Shén is traditionally credited with compiling the Shén Bin Cao Jing, the foundational text of Chinese herbal medicine, where cannabis appears among the superior class of medicinal herbs, plants believed to be non-toxic and capable of promoting health and longevity with regular use. According to both Abel and Russo, cannabis in early Chinese medicine was employed to treat a range of ailments. It was prescribed for conditions such as constipation, rheumatism, malaria, and even memory loss. The seeds, rich in fatty acids and protein, were valued for their laxative properties, while other parts of the plant were used in decoctions or ground into powders. These remedies were typically non-psychoactive. Early medical practice focused on the nutritional and physical benefits of cannabis rather than its mind-altering effects. The medical literature also displays a nuanced understanding of the plant's sexual differentiation. As Russo observes, the Chinese identified male plants, Shi, and female plants, Chu, with the females generally preferred for medicinal preparations due to their resinous flowering tops. This botanical awareness suggests that early cultivators not only observed morphological differences, but also selected plants based on their pharmacological efficacy. Cannabis was not administered in isolation. It formed part of a complex materia medica, in which herbs were classified by their energetic properties, flavors, and their effects on the body's vital systems. Cannabis was considered to have a cooling nature and was often used to clear excess heat, a term in traditional Chinese medicine linked to inflammation, fever, and overactivity. It was also thought to enter the liver and spleen meridians, situating it within a broader network of therapeutic principles that govern Chinese medical thought. Importantly, cannabis was not stigmatized within this framework. It was regarded as one plant among many, respected for its specific effects, but neither fetishized nor feared. Its classification as a superior herb implies a degree of trust and cultural familiarity. For early Chinese physicians and their patients, cannabis was part of a natural pharmacopoeia, accessible and effective, rooted in centuries of empirical observation and embedded in a holistic model of health and balance. Cannabis also held a place within the ritual and metaphysical dimensions of ancient Chinese thought, particularly as Taoist traditions began to take shape. While the earliest uses of cannabis were predominantly utilitarian and medicinal, by the time of the late Warring States period and into the Han Dynasty, the plant began to appear in spiritual texts and practices associated with religious Taoism. Russo notes that certain Taoist sects employed cannabis in incense preparations, particularly in ceremonies aimed at inducing altered states of consciousness or visionary insight. Taoist practitioners believed that the inhalation of specific incense fumes could facilitate communication with immortals or deities. Cannabis, often combined with ginseng and other herbs, was thought to aid meditation and spiritual clarity. This is not to say that cannabis was used recreationally. Rather, it was a controlled substance within ritual protocols, meant to open the mind to hidden realms or refine inner energies. The goal was not intoxication, but transcendence, an elevated state of awareness aligned with Taoist cosmology. Mentions of cannabis appear in esoteric Taoist texts such as the Wushang Biao and Bio Puzi, where it is linked to techniques of inner alchemy and mystical insight. In these contexts, cannabis played a role similar to that of incense in other religious traditions. It was a mediator between the human and the divine, the mundane and the sacred. It is unclear how widespread such practices were, but their presence in Taoist literature indicates that cannabis had begun to acquire symbolic and experiential meaning beyond its agricultural or therapeutic value. This spiritual use likely emerged from earlier observations of the plant's psychoactive properties, particularly when prepared in concentrated forms. Unlike the low-resin fiber hemp used in textile production, certain varieties of cannabis cultivated for their resin would have produced more noticeable effects when burned or ingested. Such properties, initially secondary to the plant's material usefulness, were gradually ritualized and given philosophical significance within Taoist doctrine. It's important to note that while cannabis played a role in some esoteric rituals, it never attained the central sacramental status that other psychoactive plants did in other ancient cultures. Its use in Taoist contexts remained selective, often metaphorical, and integrated into a broader spiritual system that emphasized harmony with nature, subtle energy cultivation, and disciplined inner practice. Nonetheless, its inclusion in this sphere reflects the evolving complexity of how early Chinese civilization understood the plant, not just as a source of nourishment or healing, but as a substance capable of mediating between the physical and the metaphysical. Archaeological evidence from Central Asia provides some of the earliest and most definitive documentation of cannabis being used for its psychoactive properties. Unlike the practical and medical roles it played in China, cannabis in this context appears explicitly in connection with ritual activity, burial customs, and what can be described as proto-shamanic practices. The most compelling example comes from the Yonghai tombs, located in the Turpan Basin of what is now Xinjiang, western China, a region historically inhabited by Indo-European-speaking peoples linked culturally to the greater Central Asian steppes. As detailed by Russo, the grave of a male individual, likely a shaman or spiritual specialist, dated to approximately the 8th century BCE, was found to contain nearly 800 grams of cannabis. This material was not in the form of coarse hemp stalks or seeds used for oil or textiles. Instead, it consisted of the flowering tops of the plant, well preserved by the arid climate, with a measurable concentration of tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the principal psychoactive compound in cannabis. Laboratory analysis confirmed that this was not industrial hemp. It was a deliberately cultivated psychoactive variety, selected and preserved with evident intention. The context of the burial underscores its ritual significance. The individual was buried with a harp, a bridle, and various ceremonial items, suggesting a status that combined religious, musical, and possibly healing functions. The placement of the cannabis near the body, and its quantity and quality, indicate that it was not incidental. It was part of the individual's identity and likely central to his role in the community. Russo emphasizes that this is the earliest scientifically confirmed evidence of psychoactive cannabis use anywhere in the world. The Yonghai find is not isolated. Across the Central Asian steppes, from the Altai Mountains to the Iranian plateau, cannabis appears in ritual contexts. This pattern aligns with ancient Indo-Iranian spiritual traditions in which fire, smoke, and altered consciousness played key roles in religious experience. While specific texts such as the Avesta and the Rig Veda refer more explicitly to substances like hauma or soma, there is scholarly debate about whether cannabis may have been among the plants associated with these rituals. Moreover, these Central Asian practices prefigure what Herodotus would later describe among the Scythians, a nomadic people of the same broader cultural region, who engaged in vapor inhalation ceremonies using hemp seeds. Although Herodotus wrote centuries after the Yonghai burial, the continuity in ritual cannabis use across time and space is striking. The evidence suggests that cannabis was not only cultivated for material uses or medicine, but had also become, in specific cultural environments, a plant used to alter consciousness within sacred and ceremonial frameworks. This Central Asian tradition of cannabis use illustrates an important shift. Here, the plant was no longer merely an agricultural commodity or a pharmacological agent. It was now associated with rites of passage, contact with the dead, and the mediatory functions of religious specialists. Cannabis in this setting was not only a cultivated plant, it was a sacred tool, selected and consumed for its capacity to transform perception and mark the boundary between the living and the divine. The ritual use of cannabis among the Scythians, as described by Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, offers one of the earliest literary accounts of cannabis being deliberately employed for its psychoactive effects in a communal setting. The Scythians were a nomadic people who roamed the vast Eurasian steppe, from the Black Sea through Central Asia, and maintained complex cultural and trade relations with neighboring civilizations, including the Greeks and Persians. Their funerary and purification customs, as reported in Histories, Book 4, demonstrate a culturally sanctioned use of cannabis smoke for both ritual and sensory transformation. Herodotus describes a practice whereby the Scythians would construct small enclosures using wooden poles covered with felt or woolen blankets. Inside these tents, they placed red-hot stones in a central pit and then threw hemp seeds onto the stones, producing thick, aromatic smoke. Participants would inhale the fumes, which Herodotus claimed caused them to howl with pleasure. Though his language is shaped by the perspective of an outsider, it is evident that the use of cannabis in this context was both intentional and effect-oriented, meant to purify, exalt, or otherwise transform the participant's state of being. Russo references this account in relation to the broader archaeological and ethnobotanical evidence of psychoactive cannabis use among steppe cultures. While the seeds alone have limited psychoactive potency, it is possible that Herodotus conflated seeds with flowering tops or resin-rich material that would have produced more pronounced effects. Alternatively, the ritual may have involved the inhalation of burning terpenes and minimal amounts of cannabinoids sufficient to induce a mild euphoria in an enclosed space. The ritual character of the practice is significant. These were not informal gatherings, but culturally prescribed rites, often associated with death and transition. The tents functioned as temporary sacred spaces, separating the participants from the mundane world. Within this contained environment, cannabis smoke was employed to cleanse, sanctify, and perhaps connect with ancestral spirits or the divine. The use of fire, vapor, and altered states in these rituals parallels traditions across many early Eurasian cultures, reinforcing the idea that cannabis had by this time become a recognized tool for sacred experience. Importantly, the Scythians were not an isolated phenomenon. Similar ceramic braziers and scorched hemp residues have been discovered at various steppe burial sites dating back to the early Iron Age. These finds provide material confirmation of Herodotus' narrative and support the notion of a widespread ritual use of cannabis among mobile pastoralist societies across Central Asia. The Scythian example marks a moment in the cultural history of cannabis when the plant's psychoactive properties were not only known but formalized into religious and communal life. Here, cannabis was not a marginal substance. It was part of a public, collective rite, embedded in the cosmology and mortuary traditions of a people for whom the boundary between this world and the next was ritually negotiated through fire, smoke, and sensory transformation. Ancient Egyptian sources offer compelling evidence that cannabis was integrated into medical practice, particularly as a therapeutic agent rather than a recreational or ritual substance. While the textual record does not provide direct references to psychoactive effects, cannabis appears in several key medical papyri, dating as far back as the 2nd millennium BCE, and is consistently associated with treatments for inflammation, gynecological conditions, and pain relief. The most significant of these texts is the Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BCE, although its contents may be based on much older oral traditions. As both Abel and Russo note, this document includes prescriptions that likely refer to cannabis under the term shemshemet. In one formula, it is recommended as an ingredient in a preparation for easing hemorrhoidal pain, administered rectally. Other prescriptions suggest its use in treating sore eyes and inflammation, typically through topical application. These modes of administration, especially through oils and salves, suggest that cannabis was used for its analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties rather than its psychoactive effects. Another key source, the Ramesseum III papyrus, circa 1700 BCE, offers additional examples of medical treatments involving cannabis. In these texts, cannabis was often combined with other substances, such as honey, animal fats, and natron, to create ointments. Such combinations reveal a degree of pharmacological knowledge about solubility and delivery mechanisms, particularly in the context of inflammation and gynecological care. Abel highlights the inclusion of cannabis in treatments for women's ailments, including labor pains and menstrual disorders. The use of suppositories and vaginal applications points to a sophisticated understanding of localized relief through plant-based compounds. Cannabis was clearly valued for its ability to reduce discomfort, particularly in sensitive or painful regions of the body. In contrast to its emerging psychoactive use in Central Asia, cannabis in Egypt appears in the medical literature primarily as a functional healing agent, with no evident stigmatization or religious connotation. It was one of many plants in the Egyptian pharmacopoeia, a natural resource deployed in support of bodily health. Russo also emphasizes the empirical nature of this usage. Egyptian healers were working within a tradition of observed efficacy rather than metaphysical speculation. It is worth noting, however, that while textual evidence points primarily to therapeutic use, the broader archaeological record is less definitive. For instance, cannabis pollen was detected on the mummy of Ramesses II, though the implications of this are debated. Whether it signals medicinal, ritual, or environmental exposure is unclear, but it does reinforce the presence of cannabis in Egyptian life at the highest social levels. Altogether, the medical use of cannabis in ancient Egypt reflects a plant deeply integrated into the practical and empirical traditions of healing. Its effects were understood and applied through observation and repeated use, forming part of a system that prioritized balance, bodily harmony, and effective intervention over intoxication or altered consciousness. Within this context, cannabis functioned not as a mystical agent, but as a reliable tool of early clinical knowledge. Beyond medicine, cannabis also played a functional and widespread role as a source of fiber in ancient Egyptian society. While textual sources emphasize its pharmacological use, archaeological and historical evidence points to its integration into Egypt's material economy, particularly in the production of rope, sails, and textile materials, key components of Nile-based transportation and labor systems. Abel notes that cannabis fibers were among those used to make strong ropes, netting, and coarse fabrics. These applications would have been especially significant in a civilization so dependent on riverine and maritime activity. The Nile was the principal artery of commerce, agriculture, and political control, and the tools that made navigation possible, sails, rigging, fishing lines, relied on durable, water-resistant fibers. Cannabis, with its long, strong bast fibers, would have been a natural candidate for such uses, especially alongside flax, which was more commonly associated with fine linen textiles. Although the precise identification of hemp fibers in surviving textile artifacts is often difficult, especially given the chemical similarity to other bast fibers, there is circumstantial evidence that cannabis was grown and processed for this purpose. The distinction between cannabis and flax may not always have been emphasized in ancient terminology, as both plants were part of the general repertoire of fiber crops cultivated along the Nile's fertile floodplains. Moreover, the practical nature of Egyptian fiber use likely prioritized functionality over classification. What mattered was tensile strength, availability, and resistance to rot. In this context, cannabis was part of a broader agricultural system in which plants were evaluated not as symbolic or ideological commodities, but as essential materials for sustaining imperial infrastructure. While there is less surviving written documentation about the cultivation of cannabis specifically for fiber in Egypt, its presence in the medical papyri and archaeological remains suggests a plant that was both known and utilized. Some scholars have pointed to cannabis pollen found in funerary contexts, such as on the remains of Ramesses II, not as direct evidence of ritual use, but as a byproduct of its wider agricultural cultivation. Its inclusion among burial materials may indicate that it was a recognized part of daily life, even among elites. The absence of moral judgment or regulation around cannabis in Egyptian sources further reflects its utilitarian status. It was a crop, a medicine, a material, one of many plants that underpinned the practical demands of statecraft, labor, and survival in a complex and highly stratified society. Its value lay in what it could do: heal, bind, support, and endure. And in this regard, cannabis fits seamlessly into the logic of ancient Egyptian resource management and technological ingenuity. The spread of cannabis from East Asia through Central Asia and into the Near East and North Africa was not the result of a single cultural transmission, but part of a broader process of botanical diffusion tied to trade, pastoral migration, and ecological adaptation. By the second millennium BCE, cannabis had become a recognizable plant across multiple, otherwise distinct civilizations, each of which incorporated it into local practices according to their needs, cosmologies, and material conditions. This diffusion likely began with the westward movement of cannabis from early Neolithic China into the Central Asian steppe. As Abel outlines, cannabis was domesticated in China not only for fiber and food, but also, eventually, for medicinal and spiritual purposes. The plant's hardiness and utility made it ideal for transfer along early transcontinental exchange routes, long before the formal establishment of the Silk Road. Pastoral nomads, such as the Proto-Indo-Europeans and later the Scythians, served as key vectors for this movement. As these groups moved westward, they carried with them seeds, processing techniques, and cultural knowledge, effectively transforming cannabis into a pan-Eurasian crop. In Central Asia, cannabis underwent an important shift in use. As discussed by Russo, it was selectively bred and prepared for its psychoactive effects. Archaeological finds like the Yonghai tombs and Scythian burial sites demonstrate the emergence of cannabis not only as a medicinal herb or fiber source, but as a plant capable of inducing altered states that were incorporated into ritual, funerary, and possibly judicial ceremonies. From Central Asia, cannabis entered the Iranian plateau and the Near East, where it likely influenced early Zoroastrian rituals and became entangled with traditions involving sacred fire, incense, and plant-based elixirs. While texts like the Avesta refer more explicitly to hauma, a ritual drink of uncertain botanical identity, there is ongoing scholarly debate about whether cannabis might have been among the plants included in its preparation or at least known to religious specialists in the region. The eventual presence of cannabis in ancient Egypt must be viewed in light of this broader network of botanical and cultural circulation. Egypt was not isolated. It maintained active trade and diplomatic relationships with the Levant, the Sinai Peninsula, and across the Red Sea into Arabia and East Africa. While Egyptian sources emphasize the therapeutic and utilitarian dimensions of cannabis, the plant's arrival and assimilation into local practices would have depended on earlier transmissions and transformations that occurred well outside the Nile Valley. This multi-directional movement of cannabis exemplifies how plants were not simply traded as commodities, but adapted to fit new symbolic and functional roles within different societies. Each culture that received cannabis modified its use and meaning. What was a textile crop in one region became a healing balm in another, a ritual incense in a third. The plant's versatility allowed it to be embedded in varied social frameworks, while its resilience ensured its survival across ecological zones. The fact that cannabis appears in so many ancient contexts, China, Central Asia, the Iranian plateau, and Egypt, by the close of the second millennium BCE, is not incidental. It is the result of dynamic patterns of contact, mobility, and adaptation. The plant was not merely spread, it was adopted, translated, and reinterpreted, serving as a botanical mirror of the human cultures that cultivated it. In the civilizations where cannabis first appeared, whether in East Asia, Central Asia, or the Nile Valley. There is no indication that the plant was ever regarded with suspicion or moral condemnation. On the contrary, early uses of cannabis were characterized by familiarity, practicality, and, in certain cases, reverence. Whether employed as a source of fiber, a medicinal substance, or a ritual tool, cannabis was integrated into the cultural and technological systems of these societies without apparent stigma. This stands in stark contrast to the way cannabis would be perceived in much later periods, particularly under colonial and prohibitionist regimes in the 19th and 20th centuries. In ancient China, as Abel and Russo both document, cannabis was classified among the superior herbs in Shén pharmacopoeia. It was listed alongside ginseng and other life-promoting substances, not as a dangerous agent, but as a plant conducive to long-term health when used correctly. The differentiation between male and female plants and the detailed descriptions of its medicinal applications demonstrate not only an empirical interest in the plant, but also an absence of fear regarding its psychoactive properties. In the Taoist context, where cannabis was sometimes used in visionary practices, it was seen as a substance that could assist in achieving spiritual insight, not as something corrupting or destabilizing. Similarly, in Central Asia, cannabis was not merely tolerated, it was ritualized. The presence of psychoactive cannabis in the Yonghai tombs and the practices described by Herodotus among the Scythians indicate a culture in which altered states of consciousness were meaningful and even necessary in certain ceremonial or funerary contexts. These practices were not marginal. They were public, sanctioned, and embedded in the social order. The sensory effects of cannabis were harnessed to fulfill communal, symbolic, and spiritual functions. In Egypt, cannabis was incorporated into the medical tradition, appearing in respected documents like the Ebers Papyrus. Its use in salves, ointments, and suppositories shows that it was regarded as a legitimate therapeutic agent. No papyrus warns against cannabis as a harmful or immoral substance. The plant was not criminalized, feared, or restricted, it was prescribed. This widespread cultural neutrality, or even acceptance, is significant. It demonstrates that cannabis's historical status as a regulated or prohibited substance is a modern development, not an ancient one. The early civilizations that interacted with the plant did so within frameworks of empirical observation, utilitarian need, and spiritual meaning. There is no evidence of taboo, nor of institutional efforts to suppress its use. On the contrary, the documentation from these periods shows a high degree of cultural confidence in cannabis's place within the natural order. What emerges from this early record is a portrait of cannabis as a normalized, integrated part of ancient human life. It was used deliberately, understood within the cosmologies and practical systems of early societies, and never subjected to the binary classification of good versus bad that would define its treatment in later legal and ideological frameworks. Its status as a plant of value, material, medicinal, and at times metaphysical, was largely uncontested. The historical record of cannabis in antiquity reveals a plant that was embedded in the practical and symbolic economies of early civilizations, valued, used, and circulated without stigma or criminal designation. Across regions as culturally distinct as ancient China, Central Asia, and Egypt, cannabis was incorporated into the structures of everyday life, whether through medicine, agriculture, ritual, or material production. In none of these contexts was the plant treated as inherently dangerous or morally suspect. What unites these early uses is not simply the plant's versatility, but the degree to which it was trusted. Cannabis was regarded as a reliable tool, selected for its observable effects, cultivated for its measurable utility, and deployed across multiple spheres of human need. In China, it was a staple crop and a medical herb. In Central Asia, a sacramental substance with clear psychoactive properties. In Egypt, a therapeutic compound and a source of industrial-strength fibers. These were not peripheral uses. They were central to the functioning of society, from healing the body to equipping ships and sanctifying the dead. This historical normalization underscores the extent to which modern prohibitions are a rupture, not a continuation of earlier traditions. As Kyo Zanin argues in his thesis, the vilification of cannabis emerged much later, primarily in the context of European colonial expansion, racialized social control, and the rise of modern pharmaceutical and carceral regimes. The shift from a valued resource to a prohibited substance occurred not because of a universal discovery of harm, but through legal and ideological constructions forged in the 19th and 20th centuries. These constructions were exported globally, often overriding or erasing older indigenous and traditional relationships with the plant. Thus, the ancient history of cannabis reveals more than its uses. It reveals a different epistemology, one in which plants were not criminalized based on their psychoactive potential, but instead evaluated through sustained engagement, observation, and adaptation. Cannabis was part of a broader pharmacological and ecological literacy that linked humans with the environments they inhabited. Its integration into ancient societies reminds us that prohibition is not inevitable. It is contingent, political, and recent. The early history of cannabis stands, then, as both a record and a counterpoint. A record of how societies once worked with the plant without fear, and a counterpoint to the dominant narratives that would later cast it as a symbol of danger or disorder. In its earliest chapters, cannabis was not a threat to be suppressed. It was a resource to be cultivated, a medicine to be trusted, and in some cases, a sacred substance to be revered.